Our consideration of free will and moral responsibility has been driven so far by these three sentences. And we saw that the determinists come in and they grab onto that first pair of statements and they say, here's our pair. This is what we're rolling with. We think statement number 1 and statement number 2 are true, but not statement number 3. And then you can see how there's this whole kind of worldview that kind of unfolds from grabbing onto those first two statements. There's a way of thinking about your experience of your life and what actually you're experiencing that is implied by grabbing onto those first two statements. So the existentialists come along and they say, no. You're half right, determinists. The second sentence is definitely true. The second sentence definitely, we think, is an accurate representation of the structure of reality. But we don't accept the first statement. Instead, we accept the third. And then you can see again how this kind of implies a particular worldview about the meaning of your life and the experience of it and what it means to experience reality. But there's another pair possible, right? There's one pair of statements that we haven't explored, and that is 1 and 3. And so I would ask you, when you look at 1 and 3, is it possible to choose them and have a worldview that is coherent in the same way that the determinists and the libertarians' choices led to a worldview that's coherent? Even if we don't agree with it, we can see that something unfolds from their choices that is logically coherent. Is that also the case for someone who grabs onto statements 1 and 3? Or are these statements kind of mutually exclusive? Or, not the wrong word, not mutually exclusive. Are these two statements incoherent when they're combined? Do they have some kind of inconsistency? Can they not be true at the same time? I wonder what your answer is. The compatibilists would say it's perfectly appropriate to grab onto statements 1 and 3. In fact, that's what we do as compatibilists. We agree with everything the determinists said about all events being determined by prior physical events. And that would include thoughts and choices that human beings experience. We totally agree with the determinists on that. Where we disagree with the determinists on that is, in concluding that just because we're totally determined absolves us of all moral responsibility. We think, the compatibilists say, that moral responsibility and determinism are actually compatible with one another. Okay? And you're thinking to yourself, how does this come together? This seems so unfair to judge somebody from doing something because they've done something that they couldn't have avoided doing, or for praising them for doing something that they couldn't have avoided doing, because everything they do is determined, just like the determinists say. Okay, and this is kind of it's a kind of counterintuitive philosophy until you kind of meditate on it for a while, and then it starts to make a little bit more sense. Compatibilist says this: your actions are determined by your values, your fears, your desires, your personality, your beliefs, your motives, your psychological states, your biology, you take the sum total of all that defines who you are, and as long as you are free from external forces, in other words, as long as you have circumstantial freedom and you're not locked up in somebody's basement or tied to a tree, you have the freedom necessary to be responsible for your actions, okay? Therefore, you're responsible for your actions. And you're thinking, this just doesn't make sense. If my actions are determined, how do I have any freedom? And what the compatibilist is going to say is, well, metaphysical freedom isn't a freedom that really exists. So the only freedom that really matters is circumstantial freedom. And we think it's okay to hold you morally responsible for the choices that you make, even though they were determined, because this is who you are. And the choices that you make are expressions of who you are. Okay? So yes, the compatibilist is going to say, you're sort of like a puppet being your actions are kind of being determined by your environment and your family and by everything, right? But they're going to say, but nonetheless, we can still judge that, okay? And you might think about it this way. It's kind of what we do with dogs. We tend to think, I don't want to get into the whole dog psychology thing here. I'm going to oversimplify this, so no nasty grams about how dogs have souls or anything like that. But let's just work from like a Descartes assumption that dogs are more machine-like than human beings are, in the sense that they don't have the kind of intellectual complexity that we like to think that we have. And so dogs tend to be much more driven by impulse. They tend to be much more driven by instinct. They tend to be much more driven by conditioning than we like to think that we are. But nonetheless, we still judge dogs, right? So we look at a dog and we say, that's a bad dog or that's a good dog. And we have particular criteria that we'd use to make those judgments. And we're really sort of judging the quality of the dog, right? Like, is this a dog that behaves well? Or is it a dog that bites people? Is it a dog that rips up the furniture? Or is it a dog that protects my property? And so on and so forth. And compatibilists are going to say it's probably okay to think about human beings in a similar way, that just as dogs are kind of expressing their individual selves and their nature through their actions and the quote-unquote choices that they make that aren't really actually choices, human beings are kind of similar. And so it's okay for us to judge human beings just as we judge dogs. And because human beings are much more complex organisms, our moral judgments of them can be much more complex than they would be of the dog. All right? So the compatibilists, determinism and moral responsibility are perfectly compatible with one another, and they believe that these are both features of reality.